The distant rumble of thunder rolled across the parched plains of Yosemite, Wyoming. But like every storm cloud that had teased the desperate town over the past 18 months, Jane Blackburn knew it would likely drift away without dropping a single precious raindrop. Standing on the porch of her modest homestead, she clutched her father's old brass spyglass, scanning the horizon not for rain, but for the silhouette of her husband, Dawson, who'd been gone nearly 3 weeks seeking help beyond the county line. The year was 1873, and the drought had pushed Yosemite to the brink of abandonment. Jane lowered the spyglass, her calloused hands betraying the hard work that had defined her 24 years of life. 6 years ago, when Yates had ridden into town with his easy smile and gentle ways, the townsfolk had been quick to welcome the handsome cowboy. When he'd fallen in love with Jane, the odd, bookish daughter of the town's deceased doctor, their whispers had started. "He'll come to his senses," Martha Wilkins had said loud enough for Jane to hear at the general store. "What kind of wife will she make a man like him? Head always in some science book or digging in the dirt like a child." Even on their wedding day 3 years ago, Jane had overheard Mrs. Peterson tell her husband, "Poor Yates. He could have had any girl in 3 counties. What does he see in that strange Blackburn girl?" The memory still stung, but Jane pushed it aside as she returned to her work. Behind her modest home stretched her experimental garden, rows of plants struggling against the merciless sun, protected by carefully constructed canvas sheets, and watered with the precious little moisture she collected through her rain-catching system. The townsfolk had laughed when she'd started building it last year. Now nobody was laughing as their wells ran dry and their crops withered. Jane knelt beside her newest project, a deeper well design she'd been studying from an Eastern scientific journal. Her father's medical books and her own collection of agricultural texts were spread around her makeshift workbench. If Yates couldn't bring back help, perhaps she could find answers in these pages. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her attention. Too small to be a storm, too deliberate to be the wind. Jane snatched up the spyglass again, her heart leaping as she made out a single rider. Yates was finally home. She ran toward the road, her skirts gathered in her hands, a mix of relief and fear churning in her stomach. The closer he came, the more she could see the slump in his shoulders. His usually pristine hat was coated with dust, and his horse plodded forward with weary steps. Yates dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, gathering Jane in his arms without a word. She felt the tremor in his body, the desperation in his embrace. "No one's coming, are they?" she whispered against his chest. He pulled back, his blue eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "The territorial government says there's not enough money to dig new wells or bring in water. Every town within 100 miles is suffering the same fate." He took a deep breath. "Mayor Collins has called a town meeting tonight. People are talking about abandoning Yosemite altogether." Jane felt a chill despite the heat. "We can't just leave. This is our home." Yates cupped her cheek, a streak of dirt transferring from his hand to her skin. "I know, darling, but we might not have a choice. The cattle are dying, the crops are gone, and now the Petersons' youngest has fallen ill from drinking bad water." Jane glanced back at her experiments, her mind racing. "Give me time, Yates. I've been studying techniques from places that suffer droughts all the time." "There might be a way, Jane," he interrupted gently, "the way one might speak to a child with impossible dreams. Your ideas are wonderful, but we need real solutions now, not theories from books." She stiffened slightly. Even Yates, who had always championed her intelligence, was beginning to doubt. "I'll go to the meeting," she said quietly, stepping back from his embrace. "But I'm not giving up on Yosemite just yet." The town hall was packed that evening. Every resident of Yosemite had crowded into the stifling room, faces drawn with worry and exhaustion. Mayor Collins, a portly man with an impressive mustache now flecked with gray, stood at the front, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying through the murmurs, "I wish I had better news. But as you all know, Yates Dawson returned today from his mission to seek aid. The territorial government has turned down our request for assistance." A groan rippled through the crowd. "I've given this a great deal of thought, and I believe we must face facts. Yosemite cannot survive this drought. I propose we begin preparations to relocate within the month." The room erupted in a mixture of protests and agreements. Jane sat beside Yates, watching as neighbors argued with each other, some insisting they couldn't abandon generations of work, others pointing out they couldn't drink sentiment or pride. Sheriff Rogan pounded his fist on a nearby table. "Quiet down. Let the mayor finish," Collins nodded gratefully. "I know this isn't what any of us want, but I see no alternative. Our well is nearly dry, the river is little more than a trickle, and we've lost nearly half our livestock. Those with family elsewhere should make arrangements immediately." Jane felt something hardening within her. Without planning to, she found herself standing. Yates tugged at her hand, but she gently pulled away. "Mayor Collins," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "I believe there might be another option." The room fell silent, but it wasn't the respectful quiet of people willing to listen. It was the awkward hush of collective embarrassment, like when a child speaks out of turn among adults. Mayor Collins cleared his throat. "Mrs. Dawson, I appreciate your optimism, but now is hardly the time for what, Mayor? For trying to save our town." Jane stepped into the center aisle. "My father taught me that knowledge is more valuable than gold, especially in times of crisis. I've been studying drought management techniques from around the world, and I believe there are methods we haven't tried." Thomas Wilkins, the general store owner, let out an exasperated sigh. "Jane, dear, we respect your father's memory, but reading about something in a book isn't the same as practical experience." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jane felt her cheeks burn but pressed on. "The ancient Nabateans built entire cities in deserts more punishing than anything we've seen here. They developed water conservation systems that sustained thousands of people." She turned, making eye contact with as many people as she could. "I've designed modifications to our existing wells and water catchment systems that could increase our capacity significantly." Martha Wilkins tittered. "And I suppose you'll be the one swinging the pickaxes and hauling the stones." A few chuckles followed, and Jane saw Yates rise to her defense, but she placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "No, Mrs. Wilkins. I expect the men of Yosemite to do what they've always done, work hard to protect their families and their futures. But I can show them where to dig and how to build systems that work." Jane turned to the mayor. "All I'm asking is for 2 weeks. Let me prove these methods can work before we abandon everything we've built here." Mayor Collins exchanged glances with Sheriff Rogan and several other town elders. Jane could read the skepticism in their faces, the polite dismissal forming on their lips. To her surprise, it was old Harold Jenkins who spoke up. At nearly 70, he was the oldest resident of Yosemite, his leathery face a map of the Wyoming Territory's harsh conditions. "I say we give her a chance," he announced, his voice gruff but clear. "My grandpappy told stories of Indians who lived in these parts for generations before white folks came along. They survived droughts before, and they didn't have fancy government help or newfangled science books." He nodded toward Jane. "But they had knowledge passed down. Maybe this girl's book learning is our version of that wisdom." A murmur went through the crowd, this time with a different tone. Mayor Collins stroked his mustache thoughtfully. 2 weeks is a long time when people are thirsty, Mrs. Dawson. I understand that, Jane replied, but 2 weeks is a small investment compared to abandoning our homes forever. After a long pause, Collins nodded slowly. Very well. You have 1 week, not two, to show us these methods of yours can produce results. If we don't see significant improvement by next Thursday's meeting, we begin evacuation plans immediately. Jane felt a surge of both relief and panic. 7 days to save an entire town. Thank you, Mayor. I won't let you down. As the meeting dispersed, Jane felt Yates's arm slip around her waist. You never cease to amaze me, he whispered, but she could hear the concern beneath his pride. 1 week isn't much time. It's all the time we have, she replied, her mind already racing through the tasks ahead. I'll need your help convincing the men to work with me. Yates squeezed her hand. You'll have it, but Jane. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. If this doesn't work, we need to be prepared to leave with the others. I won't risk your health staying in a ghost town with no water. Jane looked into the eyes of the man who had believed in her when no one else had, who had seen past the strange Blackburn girl to the woman beneath. I understand, but this will work, Yates. It has to. Dawn broke over Yosemite with the same merciless sun that had scorched the land for months. But Jane was already awake, having barely slept. She'd spent the night poring over her notes, sketching diagrams and calculating measurements. When Yates found her at the kitchen table, she was surrounded by papers covered in figures and designs. I need 10 men to start digging at the dry creek bed, she said without preamble, accepting the cup of precious coffee he offered. And I need to talk to Mr. Sullivan about using his forge. Yates nodded, studying the diagrams. These are impressive, Jane, but will the men listen to you? They'll listen to you, she replied. And to Mayor Collins, who's given his word we can try this. By mid-morning, Jane stood at the edge of the creek bed that had once fed Yosemite's farms and ranches. A group of men, including Yates, watched her skeptically as she walked the dried earth, occasionally stopping to examine the soil or check her compass. The ancient Kanat systems of Persia were built to tap into groundwater and transport it over long distances without losing much to evaporation, she explained, pointing to the surrounding hills. We need to locate the water table and dig a series of connected wells that will bring water to the surface. Thomas Wilkins crossed his arms. And how exactly do we find this water table when every well we've dug in the past year has come up dry? Jane pulled a rolled parchment from her satchel, a map she'd spent months creating. Because we've been digging in the wrong places, Mr. Wilkins. My father kept rainfall and well-level records for 20 years. I've continued his work and mapped the underground water patterns. She pointed to a specific spot on her map. This is where we need to dig. The spot was nearly a mile from where the town had been focusing its efforts. The men exchanged doubtful glances. That's Fisher's old property, Sheriff Rogan noted. Been abandoned since he passed last winter. Precisely, Jane replied. And it sits at the lowest point of the valley, where water would naturally collect underground. After more discussion and no small amount of grumbling, the men agreed to begin digging. Jane worked alongside them, ignoring the uncomfortable glances when she rolled up her sleeves and picked up a shovel. Yates stayed close, silently challenging anyone who might object to his wife's participation. By sunset, they had dug 6 feet down with no sign of moisture. The men left discouraged, their faces grim as they returned to their thirsty families. Jane remained at the site, examining the soil at the bottom of the hole. We should head home, Yates said gently. You need rest. Jane shook her head. The soil is changing here. See this darker layer. We're getting closer. She looked up at her husband, determination etched into her features. "I can't stop now, Yates." He sighed, then shed his jacket and picked up a shovel. "Then neither will I." They worked by lantern light, taking turns digging deeper as the night air cooled around them. Near midnight, Jane's shovel hit something that made a different sound. She dropped to her knees, brushing away dirt with her hands. "Yates, look!" The soil was damp. Not wet, but unmistakably moister than anything they'd seen in months. Yates touched it, his eyes widening. "You were right." "We're close," Jane whispered, excitement making her voice tremble. "We're so close." They worked until their muscles screamed for rest, and by the time dawn broke, they had reached water, a small, muddy pool, but water nonetheless. Jane and Yates held each other at the edge of the hole, exhausted but triumphant. Word spread quickly through town. By mid-morning, more men had arrived to help, their initial skepticism giving way to cautious hope. Under Jane's direction, they began digging a series of connected tunnels and wells, following her carefully plotted map. For 3 days, the work continued. Some of the older residents still kept their distance, but others began to take notice of the strange Blackburn girl's ideas. Jane set up another team to build her rain catchment system, a network of gutters and barrels designed to collect and filter the precious little rainfall they received. On the 4th day, disaster struck. A section of tunnel collapsed, nearly trapping 2 men. No one was seriously hurt, but the accident rekindled doubts. Jane overheard the whispers as she examined the damage. "This is what happens when we listen to a woman's fancies instead of common sense. My Abigail is still sick from the bad water, and we're wasting time digging holes that collapse." Jane felt the familiar sting of their dismissal, but forced herself to focus on solutions. She spent that night redesigning the tunnel supports, incorporating techniques she'd read about in mining journals. When she presented her new plans the next morning, she was met with resistance. "I think we've humored this enough," Thomas Wilkins announced to the gathered workers. "We've lost valuable time we could have used preparing to leave." Jane stood her ground. "The tunnel collapsed because we rushed. My new design addresses the weaknesses. We're so close to creating a sustainable water source." "Mrs. Dawson," Mayor Collins said, approaching the group, "I appreciate your dedication, but Mr. Wilkins raises a valid point. We've invested 4 days with little to show except muddy holes and a dangerous cave-in." "That's not true," came a voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see Harold Jenkins making his way toward them, leaning heavily on his cane. "Show them, girl." Jane hesitated, then led the group to the first well they had dug. In the days since its discovery, the muddy pool had transformed. Clear water now filled the bottom of the well, enough to fill several buckets. "We tested it this morning," Jenkins said. "It's clean. Cleaner than what we've been drinking from the town these past months." Mayor Collins peered down into the well, his expression shifting from skepticism to cautious hope. "How much water can we expect from this system, Mrs. Dawson?" Jane explained the rest of her plan, how the connected wells would create a steady flow, how her rain catchment system would supplement the supply, and how proper water management could stretch their resources until the drought broke. "I can't promise endless water," she admitted, "but I believe we can create a sustainable system that will see Yosemite through this drought and others that might come." The mood shifted. Men who had been ready to abandon the project picked up their tools again. Even Thomas Wilkins, after a long moment of consideration, nodded his reluctant agreement to continue. As they returned to work with renewed purpose, Yates pulled Jane aside, his expression serious. "You did it," he said quietly. "You're winning them over." Jane shook her head. "We haven't succeeded yet. There's still so much to do, and we only have 3 days left before the mayor's deadline." Yates brushed a strand of hair from her face, tucking it behind her ear with tender care. "Do you know what I saw just now? I saw men who have worked this land for decades looking to you for leadership. Not because the mayor told them to, but because they're starting to believe in you." He smiled, a flash of pride lighting his tired face. "I always have." Jane leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his unwavering faith in her. "We should get back to work. The new tunnel supports won't build themselves." Over the next 2 days, progress accelerated. The well system began to take shape, with water flowing more consistently through the connected tunnels. Jane's rain catchment system, initially dismissed as overly complicated, proved its worth when a brief shower passed through, collecting more water than anyone had expected. By the 6th day, families were already receiving small but steady rations of clean water from the new system. Children who had been listless from thirst played again in the dusty streets. Farmers spoke cautiously of reviving smaller garden plots using Jane's water conservation techniques. On the evening before the town meeting that would decide Yosemite's fate, Jane and Yates sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the parched landscape in gold and crimson. For the first time in days, they allowed themselves a moment of rest. "You think it will be enough?" Jane asked, her head resting against Yates's shoulder. "Have we done enough to convince them?" Yates considered the question, his arm tightening around her. "I think you've given this town something more precious than water, Jane. You've given them hope." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know how proud I am to be your husband." Jane closed her eyes, savoring the moment of peace. "When you first came to Yosemite and started courting me, people said you'd come to your senses eventually. That the strange Blackburn girl wasn't meant to be a proper wife." "I remember," Yates said, his voice low. "I also remember telling Martha Wilkins that I'd rather have one conversation with you than a lifetime of empty chatter with anyone else." Jane smiled at the memory. "You never told me that." "I never wanted to hurt you with their small-minded gossip." He turned to face her fully. "Jane, when I met you, I was just another drifting cowboy with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. You saw something in me worth believing in. How could I not do the same for you?" The town hall was even more crowded than the previous week. Every resident of Yosemite had come to witness the decision that would determine their collective future. Mayor Collins called the meeting to order with a bang of his gavel. "1 week ago," he began, "we gave Mrs. Jane Dawson the opportunity to demonstrate her unconventional ideas about water management." He paused, surveying the room. "Today, we must decide whether her efforts have shown enough promise to justify remaining in Yosemite, or if we should proceed with evacuation plans." Jane sat straight-backed beside Yates, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The past week had been the most physically demanding of her life, but it was this moment facing the judgment of people who had dismissed her for years that truly tested her courage. Mayor Collins continued, "I've asked Sheriff Rogan to provide an assessment of the current water situation." Sheriff Rogan stood, adjusting his belt as he addressed the crowd. "As of this afternoon, the new well system is producing approximately 30 gallons of clean water daily. Mrs. Dawson's rain catchment added another 15 gallons from yesterday's brief shower." He cleared his throat. "It's not abundant, but it's more than we had, and the quality is good." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Thomas Wilkins raised his hand. "That's barely enough for drinking and cooking." "What about our livestock, our crops?" Before the sheriff could respond, Harold Jenkins spoke up. "My grandson and I implemented some of Mrs. Dawson's water conservation techniques in our small vegetable garden. Using half the water we normally would, our plants are showing new growth for the first time in months." Others began sharing similar experiences, modest but meaningful improvements since implementing Jane's suggestions. The mood in the room shifted palpably as hope began to outweigh doubt. Then Martha Wilkins rose, her thin frame rigid with skepticism. "This is all very interesting, but are we truly considering staking our lives on experiments and book learning? What happens when the next crisis comes? Will we turn to Mrs. Dawson's library again instead of practical experience?" The question hung in the air, and Jane felt a familiar sinking in her stomach. Some prejudices ran too deep to overcome. To her surprise, it was Thomas Wilkins who responded to his wife's challenge. "Martha," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "I've been as doubtful as anyone. But I've watched Mrs. Dawson work alongside men twice her size this past week, not just giving orders but getting her hands dirty, and I've seen results." He turned to face the room. "My father taught me that a man who can't admit when he's wrong is a fool. Well, I was wrong about Jane Dawson." A heavy silence followed his words. Jane felt Yates's hand close around hers, a silent show of support. Mayor Collins stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Perhaps the most important question is this: do we believe Mrs. Dawson's systems can sustain us through the remainder of this drought, however long it may last?" Jane stood, sensing this was her moment to make a final case for her town. "Mayor Collins, I cannot predict the future. I cannot promise that the drought will end tomorrow or next month or even next year." She took a deep breath. "But I can tell you with certainty that what we've built this week is just the beginning. The systems are designed to expand. With continued work, we could double our water collection within a month." She turned to face her neighbors directly. "I know many of you have seen me as nothing more than the odd daughter of Dr. Blackburn, a girl with her nose always in a book. Perhaps that's fair. But those books, combined with what my father taught me about observation and evidence, have given me tools to help our community." Jane gestured toward the windows, where the setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. "Yosemite is our home. It's where we've built our lives, where many of you have buried your loved ones and welcomed new babies into the world. Are we really willing to abandon it without exhausting every possible solution?" She pointed to Martha Wilkins. "Mrs. Wilkins asks what happens in the next crisis. I say we face it together, using both practical experience and the knowledge we can gather from others who have faced similar challenges before us. That's not weakness, it's wisdom." The room fell silent as Jane retook her seat. Yates squeezed her hand, pride evident in his eyes. Mayor Collins cleared his throat. "I believe we're ready to decide. Those in favor of continuing Mrs. Dawson's water management efforts and remaining in Yosemite, please stand." For a heart-stopping moment, no one moved. Then Harold Jenkins pushed himself to his feet with his cane. Thomas Wilkins followed, then Sheriff Rogan. One by one, nearly every person in the room stood. Even Martha Wilkins, after a long hesitation and a pointed look from her husband, rose reluctantly to her feet. Relief washed over Jane like a cool rain. They would stay. Yosemite would survive. "It appears we have our answer," Mayor Collins announced, a smile finally breaking through his serious demeanor. "We will continue implementing Mrs. Dawson's water management plan and remain in our town." He banged his gavel. "But let's be clear, this will require continued hard work from everyone. This is not just Mrs. Dawson's project anymore. It belongs to all of Yosemite now." As the meeting dispersed, townspeople approached Jane with questions, suggestions, and most surprisingly, apologies. Martha Wilkins kept her distance, but Jane noticed the woman watching her with a new, evaluating expression. Outside the town hall, beneath a sky studded with stars, Yates pulled Jane close. "You did it," he whispered against her hair. "We did it. she corrected him, leaning into his embrace. I couldn't have done any of this without you believing in me first. Yates smiled, his eyes reflecting the scattered light of the stars. You know, when I first rode into Yosemite, I was just looking for work and a place to rest for a while. I never expected to find home. And now? Jane asked softly. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. He glanced toward the new wells that had saved their town. Or with anyone else. Over the next 2 months, Jane's water management system expanded under her guidance. The connected wells produced a steady supply of clean water, while the rain catchment network grew to cover most of the town's main buildings. When a thunderstorm finally broke over Yosemite in late summer, the system collected enough water to fill the town's reserves for weeks. Fields that had been abandoned began to show signs of life again, as farmers implemented Jane's irrigation techniques. Livestock that had been on the brink of starvation regained their strength with access to reliable water sources. Jane found herself in the unexpected position of teacher, as neighboring towns sent representatives to learn her methods. Even Martha Wilkins eventually came to her, reluctantly asking for advice about her withering flower garden. It was a small reconciliation, but Jane accepted it graciously. One evening, as summer gave way to fall, Jane and Yates stood at the edge of their property, surveying the changes the past months had brought. Their own garden was thriving, with vegetables and drought-resistant plants creating a green oasis in the still recovering landscape. I was thinking, Yates said, his arm comfortably around Jane's waist, that we might need a bigger house soon. Jane looked up at him questioningly. Are you planning to take in boarders? A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Not exactly. But I thought our child might appreciate having a room of their own eventually. For a moment, Jane stared at him in confusion. Then understanding dawned and her hand flew to her stomach. How did you know? I only began to suspect myself last week. Yates laughed, drawing her closer. You've been falling asleep at your desk every evening. You haven't touched coffee in days, and yesterday I saw you turn green at the smell of Harold's tobacco pipe. His expression softened. I've been paying attention to you for years, Jane Dawson. I notice when things change. Joy bubbled up within her, spilling over as laughter. Well, Dr. Dawson, she teased, using the nickname the town had bestowed on her since the drought crisis, your powers of observation are impressive. I learned from the best, he replied, bending to kiss her with a tenderness that still made her heart race after years of marriage. As they walked back to their home, hand in hand, Jane reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the mocked outsider to the woman who had saved her town, from the cowboy passing through to the man who had built a life and family here, they had transformed together, like the land around them. What are you thinking about? Yates asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Jane smiled, squeezing his hand. I'm thinking that sometimes the most unlikely soil produces the strongest roots. In the years that followed, Yosemite flourished despite occasional dry spells. Jane's water management systems became a model for towns throughout the territory, and her reputation grew from local curiosity to regional expert. She began corresponding with scientists and engineers from as far away as Boston and San Francisco, sharing her practical applications of theoretical knowledge. Their first child, a son they named Daniel after Jane's father, was born the following spring. He grew into a curious, bright-eyed boy who inherited his mother's thirst for knowledge and his father's easy charm. 3 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Rose, whose determined spirit reminded everyone of Jane. The whispers that had once followed Jane through town transformed into respectful greetings and genuine friendship. Even Martha Wilkins eventually became one of her most vocal supporters, proudly telling visitors about our Jane, who had saved Yosemite when everyone else had given up hope. On the 10th anniversary of the Great Drought, the town held a celebration. A new town square had been built around one of Jane's first wells, now adorned with a simple plaque commemorating the crisis that had nearly ended Yosemite and the woman who had prevented it. As Jane stood beside Yates, watching their children play with the other town children in the square, Mayor Collins, now in his final term before retirement, raised his glass in a toast. "To Jane Dawson," he announced to the gathered crowd, "who taught us that true strength isn't always found in muscle but in mind and heart. And to Yates Dawson, who was wise enough to see what the rest of us missed." Cheers erupted, and Jane felt Yates's arm tighten around her waist. "Did you ever imagine this?" he whispered, nodding toward the celebration, the thriving town, their beautiful children. Jane looked up at the man who had chosen her when others had dismissed her, who had believed in her when even she had doubted herself. In his eyes, she still saw that young cowboy who had ridden into town and changed her life forever. "No," she admitted softly, "this is better than anything I could have imagined." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Jane and Yates sat on their porch beneath a blanket of stars, just as they had done countless nights before. Their home had expanded over the years, a new room for each child, a proper study for Jane's growing collection of scientific journals and correspondence, a workshop where Yates crafted furniture when he wasn't tending their ranch. "You know what today really marks?" Yates asked, his voice low and intimate in the darkness. Jane leaned against his shoulder, content. "The drought?" "No." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. 10 years ago today was when Yosemite finally saw what I've always seen, that you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known." Jane felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cool evening air. "You never doubted me, even when I doubted myself." "That's what partners do," he replied simply. "We see each other clearly, especially when the rest of the world doesn't." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Jane reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the scorched earth of Drought had grown not just a stronger town, but a deeper love. The whispers and mockery that had once hurt so deeply now seemed as insignificant as dust in the wind. Yosemite continued to grow and prosper in the decades that followed. Daniel eventually took over the management of their expanded ranch, implementing his mother's innovative techniques alongside his father's traditional knowledge. Rose, to no one's surprise, pursued her education in the East before returning to Wyoming territory with a degree in geology and hydrology, extending her mother's work into new scientific territory. Jane and Yates grew older together, watching their town transform from a struggling settlement into a thriving community known throughout the region for its resilience and innovation. The system of wells and water management that had saved Yosemite during its darkest hours became a foundation for sustainable growth, allowing the town to weather subsequent dry periods with confidence. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends who had become family, Yates presented Jane with a gift, a new brass spyglass, to replace her father's worn instrument. "For the woman who has always seen further than anyone else," he said, his voice now touched with age but still carrying the warmth that had first captured her heart. Jane accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, remembering the young woman who had once stood on her porch, scanning the horizon for hope. That woman could never have envisioned the rich, full life that awaited her, not just survival, but true belonging. "Thank you for riding into Yosemite all those years ago," she whispered to Yates, her hand finding his with the familiar comfort of decades shared. "Best decision I ever made," he replied with the same certainty he'd shown when he'd first asked for her hand, defying the town's expectations and his own wandering past. As the celebration continued around them, Jane gazed at the community they had helped build, not just the physical structures, but the bonds between people who had learned to value knowledge alongside experience, innovation alongside tradition. The strange Blackburn girl and the drifting cowboy had found not just each other, but a legacy that would endure long after them. In the heart of Yosemite, Wyoming, the well that had first revealed water during the Great Drought still flowed clear and strong, a testament to the woman whose strength had not been measured in brute force, but in the courage to stand firm when others faltered, to see possibility where others saw only desolation, and to love deeply enough to transform skepticism into faith. And in the generations that followed, when children asked about the origins of their thriving town, they would be told the story of Jane Blackburn Dawson, the cowboy's bride who was once mocked but whose strength had saved them all.